Uncle Trev and the Travelling Asparagus Bed by Jack Lasenby. I'm off to Institute, Mum said. You sure you'll be all right now? Of course. I hardly heard her. I was busy watching her thrust the long pins through her hat and into her hair. I was always terrified my mother would poke them right through her head. Your uncle will probably call in, if he's gone up to that stock sale. You can make him a cup of tea. There's some biscuits in a tin with the birds on it. Tell him I'm at the Institute. Don't let him go filling you up on any of his nonsense about ghosts. We can do without nightmares, thank you. I'll tell him, I said. I don't like leaving you here on your own. I'll be all right. Well, remember Mrs. Simpson's next door if you need her. If there's something nice left over from afternoon tea, I'll bring you home a taste. The door banged. She was gone. I sat feeling lonely, but enjoying having the house all to myself. I was in Mum's chair in front of the stove, listening to the sound the ash makes falling into the pan, when Uncle Trev's truck pulled up, and he came in. You on your own then? He asked, putting a piece of meat in the safe. Mum's gone to Women's Institute, I said. Ah, we're safe then. Mum said you weren't to go filling me up on any nonsense about ghosts. As if I would. Uncle Trev pushed the kettle over the ring so it began to sing. That sound, he said, reminds me of something, but I can't for the life of me remember what. Did you go to the sale? I asked, but he didn't hear me. It'll come back, he said. You know, if you try too hard to remember something, it won't come to your mind. You have to pretend you're not thinking of it. Then, when you see it coming, you grab it before it gets away on you. There, he shouted. I jumped. Almost had it, said Uncle Trev, but it got away. Now I won't remember what it was for a couple of days. But I'll tell you what it was when I catch it. He was filling the teapot from the kettle, getting the milk from the safe, looking for the sugar bowl. Ah, he said, those biscuits look all right. They're for you, I said. Mum took some to the Institute. He gave me a cup of tea, sat down with his. Uncle Trev never used saucers if Mum wasn't there. If she caught him, she'd have told him off. Then, when she gave him a saucer, he'd wait till her back was turned, tip his tea in the saucer, and drink it like that. But if she caught him, Mum used to send him off home to his farm, and he'd come in the next week and do the same thing all over again. I liked watching them. It helped to pass the time. Did I ever tell you about the time I caught the world record swordfish? Uncle Trev asked. He opened the door on the firebox, which I wasn't allowed to do, and was staring into the red-hot coals. I said he hadn't. It's a few years ago now, he said, but that American chap, Zane Grey, he was out here catching sorties, so Billy Burns and me, we thought we'd give it a go. Billy Burns had a length of tanikaha he'd been soaking in the drain for about 12 months, and we made a rod out of that. We rigged up a reel with the lid of a milk can and a couple of miles of plough line. We went over Tauranga, off Mare Island. We hooked a swordfish the size of the engine on the Ratel Express, twice as strong. He towed us up to Hotwater Beach, outside the Aldermans, and twice round White Island before he chucked it in. He was so big he broke the scales on the wharf, and they wouldn't let us use the ones at the dairy factory in case he broke them. Everybody said he was a world record. Well, you only had to look at him to see that. Billy Burns had one of those heavy old Dodge Tourers. We tied the big sortie across the luggage carrier on the back and set off across the Kaimais to Waharoa. He was so long, his sword stuck out one side and his tail out the other. We met 3 cars on the hill. One went over the bank trying to pass us, and the other 2 turned and drove back to Matamata. Of course, they've widened the road a bit since then. Big sword sticking out, it swiped the sides of all of the one-way bridges. You can still see where it gouged into the bank on the corners. People think they're marks of the picks the roadmen used, but any fool would see they were made by the beak of a giant swordfish. When we reached the top of the hill and started driving down the Matamata side, the front of the car kept lifting off the ground, so the wheels weren't touching. Billy Burns couldn't steer. I had to get out and ride on the bonnet as far as Raparapara. We got some ghoulies out of the creek there and jammed them between the bumper and the mudguards, and they held it down okay. It was after dark when we got to Waharoa and hung them in the plantation by the railway station. The next morning all the cockies had to drive their carts round the other side to get to the milk factory. Why? I asked. Uncle Trev looked at me. The horses hadn't seen a swordfish before, he said. They all stood on their hind legs in the shafts. In fact, nobody in Waikato had seen a swordfish before. People came from all over the Waikato. There was a photo in the Weekly News with Billy Burns and Jimmy Rawiri standing under him with eel spears. They told the reporter they got him in the creek down at the back of the factory. Well, when we had a bit of fun with him, I buried him in my garden and planted asparagus on top. Next spring, the asparagus came up as thick as your arm. You could see his shape, his sword, his head, his shoulders, his body, and that big tail. You could even see the fin on his back. The asparagus didn't grow anywhere else, just that patch in the shape of a giant swordfish. Good asparagus it was too, said Uncle Trev. Didn't need any salt either. Is it still growing? I asked. You're not going to believe this, said Uncle Trev, but I can't get asparagus to grow now. Not since that patch turned into a travelling asparagus bed. Travelling? Uncle Trev nodded. Travelling asparagus bed. Took me a while to work out what was going on. By that time the bed was halfway under the fence, still moving. That old swordy was swimming back underground to the sea, under my paddocks. By next spring he'd swum out past Wardville and was heading out towards Te Aroha. I thought he must have smelled the Waihau River. But the spring after that he'd taken a turn and was heading down the Hauraki Plains west of Paeroa. Each spring I had to hunt my travelling asparagus bed to get feed off it. People wouldn't believe me, of course. And your mother told me not to be so daft. I'll bet you don't believe me now. Yes, I do. My uncle looked at me, poured himself another cup of tea, and helped himself to the biscuit tin. I lost track of him somewhere down the plains, he said, near the Pipiroa ferry, but a cocky wrote a letter to the Herald about an unusually heavy crop of asparagus one spring. Drove down to his address with Billy Burns, but we were too late. Cocky said the asparagus bed had come up by itself. He got a couple of good feeds off it, and it disappeared. Billy Burns said later he'd noticed as the cocky was talking he had scales all round his mouth. Well, we tracked that travelling asparagus bed to the edge of the Hauraki Gulf, to the edge of the tide, found a great furrow under the sand and into the sea. Next Saturday, the Herald had a story about a scow that limped into the Auckland, half awash. The skipper reckoned had been attacked by a giant swordfish that punched a row of holes down each side. Luckily, he said, he was carrying timber up to Auckland for the KTC. KTC? Cody Timber Company, said Uncle Trev. Cody logs chained along the sides of the scow was all that saved him from sinking. So the skipper said. He reckoned the swordfish was humming with rage, for all the world like the noise of a kettle makes when it sings. Ah, there! Uncle Trev shouted, and I jumped. I told you I'd remember it. How'd you know it was your swordfish? I asked. Well, since when did swordies come that far down the Gulf? It chased him right in past Rangitoto. Besides, it stuck its head out of the water and spat a hook at the skipper. Photo in the Herald showed it sticking out of the side of his jaw. We recognised it at once. The hook we'd got the blacksmith to make us, to catch our big swordie. Uncle Trev went silent. I poured him another cup of tea and he ate the last biscuit. Did you ever go fishing again? I asked. No, not really, he said. What about asparagus? I asked. Have you ever grown it again? It's a funny thing, said Uncle Trev. Never been able to grow it since. Billy Burns, though, he's got a good bed. Somebody gave him a hammerhead shark they caught at the Kauaia Springs, way out the back of Matamata, and he buried it in his garden. He's had some wonderful asparagus. That's all right then, I said. I suppose you could say that. Why, what's wrong? Oh, nothing, Uncle Trev paused. Well, there is something a bit odd. Something's getting into his fowl house and eating his chooks off their perches at night. Oh, like the wild boar that ate your pig dogs off their chains, I asked. Yeah, something like that. Only, there's this strong smell of fish, and he says his asparagus tastes a bit of eggs, but that's nonsense. Uncle Trev tapped out his pipe on the stove, put a shovel of coal on the fire. Your mother will be home soon from her Women's Institute. Tell her I like the biscuits. There's no need to go bothering her with what we've been talking about, you know. He grinned at me, nodded, and tapped the side of his nose. I tapped mine and nodded back at him. Mum sniffed the air when she came in. My biscuits won first prize, she said. Good, I told her. Yes, and Mrs. Billy Burns gave me some beautiful asparagus, the best I've seen since your uncle used to grow it. Oh, he's just gone, I told her. That's all right, she said, as if I couldn't smell that foul palp of his as soon as I put my foot in the door. He said he can't grow asparagus now, I said. Did he have a cup of tea? Yes, and he said to tell you the biscuits were delicious. Typical man, said my mother. He never tastes a bit of home cooking out there. He's like all the other farmers, your uncle. He thinks if he tips a bag of that superphosphate on the garden, it'll grow vegetables. Asparagus needs more than artificial manure. When he and I were children at Mercury Bay, your grandfather caught a swordfish and dug it into his garden. Really? I said. Yes, said my mother, and he grew the best asparagus in the bay. Did you bring anything home for me? I asked. Oh, I almost forgot. Mrs. Burns won a prize with her sponge, and she sent home a piece just for you. She hoped you were feeling better. She's such a nice little person. She said we're welcome to all the asparagus we want. She and her husband, that friend of your uncle's, they can't keep up to it. It's growing so fast. I'll bet, I said, but Mum didn't hear me. Mrs. Burns said not to put any salt on it, she was saying. She said it's got quite a strong flavour already. I do enjoy a nice bit of asparagus. I wish you'd eat it, then I could plant some. It's not worth going to all that trouble just for one. I've got no swordfish anyway, I said. No, said my mother. That's true.